When we search for natural phenomena that explain how music works, cognitive studies of music offer some of our best evidence. Music theorists have been concerned about the perception of music for a long time. Here's an interesting example from Johann Kirnberger from the 18th century. Listen to the following. What meter is this in? None, actually. The pulses are all the same. Here's what Kirnberger says. If one hears a succession of equal pulses that are repeated at the same time interval, experience teaches us that we immediately divide them metrically in our minds by arranging them in groups containing an equal number of pulses. We do this in such a way that we put an accent on the first pulse of each group, or imagine hearing it stronger than the others. Kirnberger is telling us how he thinks we perceive music. Our brains naturally group items together into patterns. And even when no pattern is present, our brains invent one. Meter is natural and inevitable in music because of the quirks of our own perception. Gottfried Weber was also concerned about the perception of music. One of his most powerful insights was that of musical inertia. The idea here is that whatever the music is already doing, it tends to continue doing. He discusses 5 things that relate to or violate this concept in the chapter Habits of the Ear from his book, The Theory of Musical Composition. Weber lists 5 habits, the first of which is new commencement. We tend to believe that when a key or mode has been strongly established, we need something extraordinary to happen before we start perceiving a new key or mode. We need a modulation, a secondary dominant, or some other kind of chromaticism. Weber claims that this is not the case. Here's his example. The entire passage appears to be in C major, but Weber doesn't hear it that way. He wrote, "The ear perceives this A minor chord thus presenting itself, not as the harmony of the 6th degree of the previous key, C major, but as a minor 1 of A minor, namely, as the commencement of a new phrase in A minor." Listen again to the example. I'm going to stop on the A minor chord. Does it sound like a minor 6 in C or a minor 1 in A minor? My music theory training tells me that the chord is still in C major, yet my ear agrees with Weber. I hear it as a tonic in A minor. So you don't need chromaticism in order to modulate? Just a new chord at the beginning of a new phrase? Weber's second surprising habit of the ear has to do with the idea that the inversion of the chord can define its function. The first example he gives is of tonic 6/4 chords happening on downbeats. He claims that we are so used to hearing these chords as cadential 6/4s that most 6/4 chords on downbeats sound like tonic, even if that tonic is in another key. Here is his example. Does the minor 6/4 sound like a new tonic to you, even before I play the E dominant 7th chord to solidify the new key? Weber's third habit of the ear involves customary modulations. Weber claims that modulations using leading tones to new keys, like new dominant chords, sound more natural when moving to major keys. This is true, even when the modulation occurs in a piece that's already in a minor key. Here are Weber's examples. The first one goes to major, the second to minor. Which one sounds more natural? The fourth habit of the ear is what Weber calls partial reattunement. It involves chromatic chords that don't trigger the kind of modulation we expect. We would expect this passage to end in D. The B flat suggests a move to D minor. The A7 and the D major should confirm D is tonic. But does it? Weber answers, certainly not, for him. The passage ends in G with a half cadence. Let me play the passage with a G at the end to verify this. The fifth and final habit of the ear concerns the recurrence of passages already heard. This is based on the general observation that once we hear something a certain way, we expect to hear it that way again. If it appears differently, it will sound wrong. Here's a short passage from Mozart's Magic Flute. Weber changed the passage. He kept the 5 chord at the end, but rewrote the passage so that it doesn't modulate to D. It somehow seems wrong, but it's really not. It's just not what we expect. One of my favorite experiments concerning the perception of music was carried out by Herbert Spencer at the turn of the 20th century. In his essay Meyerbeer, he discussed the rise and fall of composers' reputations based upon changes in fashion. In discussing Meyerbeer's reputation, he lamented the fact that Meyerbeer was no longer revered. He quotes Liszt saying that he ranked Meyerbeer head and shoulders above the rest. There must be a reason for the fall of Meyerbeer's reputation, and Spencer found one in the criticism that Meyerbeer used too many scales and arpeggios. He asserted that these types of passages were devoid of content and were mere padding. He wrote, "Scale passages especially annoy me, suggesting that the composer gravelled for lack of matter, runs upstairs to find an idea, and being disappointed, comes down again." But is this criticism actually fair? Does Meyerbeer actually use more scales and arpeggios than other composers? Being the 19th century empiricist that he is, Spencer carries out an experiment. Wishing to see whether arpeggios and scale passages are more frequent in Meyerbeer than in others, I requested a lady pianist who was with me to count the number of them in the first 20 pages of 3 of his operas and in 3 of Mozart's. The results were these. Roberto, Il Diavolo, 25 scale passages, 20 arpeggios. Il Profete, 18 scale passages, 41 arpeggios. Les Huguenots, 15 scale passages, 22 arpeggios, making 58 of the one and 83 of the other. In contrast with these, there were in Mozart's Don Juan, 60 scale passages, 31 arpeggios. Zauberflöte, 57 scale passages, 10 arpeggios. Nozze di Figaro, 58 scale passages, 36 arpeggios, making a total of 175 scale passages and 77 arpeggios. Spencer comments that he has little patience for hackneyed musical ideas. He explains, "When having played demi-Mozart sonatas, I find myself exclaiming stop and skip, the result being that not 1/3 of the movements are marked as worth playing. When listening to Meyerbeer's operas as arranged for piano, this impression is not produced." Spencer's essay is of interest to me, not because it proves what it set out to, but because of what it reveals about Spencer's own perception of music. I believe that the scale and arpeggio passages that Spencer abhorred are what A.B. Marx called a gong, and what Mel Powell called going-to music. This kind of music is meant to be dramatic. It's meant to add motion. Here's the exposition of Mozart's Sonata K545. There are 2 simple themes. The rest is made up of scales and arpeggios. Statistically, the themes make up only 29% of this exposition, while the going-to music makes up 71%. I would argue that these scale passages are not unimaginative filler. They are an important part of the piece. They are what makes the piece exciting, what makes the listener anticipate what will happen next. You can't have a sonata form without this kind of music, yet Spencer asks his pianist to skip these passages when she plays for him. I remember that as a child, my perception of music was much like Spencer's. I could easily remember the themes, but I got lost in the transitions and developments. As I heard more music of this type, I began to learn to hear the twists and turns of going to music, and I began to appreciate entire pieces, and not just their themes. I think that what Spencer is inadvertently telling us is that he couldn't hear the structure of the going to music. To him, it sounded like a disconnected collection of cliched musical patterns. This is an important aspect of musical perception. Different people hear music differently. This is a big problem for any music theory that's based on musical perception. Maybe there can't be a universal theory of music perception because each person's perception is different.